Freelancing is basically freelancing. I mean, we're consultants, but people bring us in to do projects and stuff like that. I'll talk a little more about Fretless and what we do when I get to the part about my life story. But I want to talk about freelancing in general, why you might choose to do it, why you might not want to, why you might want to stay the heck away. But here we go. Hey, that's me. I don't know if you ever caught on to who I was. That's me, Davey. I've gone back and forth between freelancing and having real jobs ever since I turned 16. So freelancing, be your own boss, work in your pajamas, wear slippers all day. Right? Basically what it is. No. So why would you want to do that? Why would you want to freelance? This is Jeffrey Zeldman. He is one of the better known web designers in the world. Made some kind of revolutionary, really super early web projects in the mid-90s, such as the website for Batman Forever in 1995, which was like mind-blowing at the time. Terrible movie. Pretty cool website for 1995. And he was actually a big part of the reason that browsers started actually implementing standards like CSS. Because remember the horror stories we told about the 90s with Internet Explorer versus Netscape, and how nothing worked everywhere and everyone was just implementing a bunch of proprietary features. Well, Zeldman, Zeldman.com, who also started a list apart, if you've ever heard of a list apart. If not, it's a really good online zine for front-end stuff. Really, really good, and a lot of how I learned the stuff I learned in the late 90s and early 2000s. None of that has anything to do with what I'm about to say. But he worked in advertising before striking out on his own to do web design full-time. And here's how he described it, and this just really resonated with me. I was working as a creative director at a New York startup in 1999. Despite my title, I felt powerless to affect the company's product or even control our design and code. I just wanted to design simple websites that mattered and charge a fair price for my work. So I quit. Does this resonate with anyone already? I mean, you're early in your careers yet, but I still saw some nods in the morning already, like, yeah, I'm already super cynical about employment. But my last job before this was as an enterprise software manager and project manager for a very large organization with over 1,000 IT staff and over 40,000 employees total. And I was managing a big, important project. I had a cool title, enterprise software manager, heck yeah. And I was managing the development team for that project. But I was powerless. Despite my fancy title, I was not empowered to make any decisions that actually affected the outcome. The real decisions were being made by people who made 3 or 4 times what I did, and who would probably never even lay eyes on the finished product. That was one of the most frustrating things about working for an enterprise-type organization, is the people making the purchasing decisions, and sometimes the design decisions, never had to live with the consequences. They never even saw the software, but they dictated exactly how it was going to be done, to practically to the individual character, it seemed like sometimes. So I quit. Zeldman continues, I spent too many of my formative creative years complaining about the decisions made by the people who paid my salary. It was time to stop complaining and start creating. So reason number 1 to be a freelancer, freedom. Thanks, Google Images. You can choose what projects you work on to some degree, assuming you have enough business to be choosy, but that's the goal. Get enough work that you can choose your clients and choose your projects, and better yet, choose how you approach those projects. Another reason, flexibility. Need to schedule a dentist appointment, need to take your cat to the vet, make the appointment for whatever gosh darn time you want. You don't have to beg somebody else or make it for 7 in the morning or stuff, unless you want to, like Seth. I used to make my dentist appointment at 7 a.m. when I had that enterprise software manager thing, because I was in meetings all day, not accomplishing anything. Variety, another good reason. Find it boring to work on a single product year after year? As a freelancer, you don't have to be stuck on the same thing forever. Now, there are advantages to working on the same project over time. You get to see it mature and grow and become more robust and all that stuff. Dave and I had this experience working on the same product for years at a previous job. And every once in a while, we get to talk and we're like, yeah, I kind of missed that thing. I kind of want to go back and rewrite that. So it is sometimes nice to have some continuity. But also, my attention span isn't that long. Squirrel! my attention span isn't that long, and I like to switch projects every once in a while. But truly, freelancing is not for everyone. I have no idea what. Presumably, you're here because you're interested in coding, using your wits and creativity to build products and solve interesting problems. How do you feel about sales and marketing? You like those? If you strike out on your own and you don't do that, there won't be any of that more interesting work to do. Got to do it. How about bookkeeping? Yeah, sound like a blast? Management? If you start even a small agency, as we did with Fretless, expect to spend at least some time on management tasks. Even if you have people who can manage themselves to a large degree, you can't completely neglect that stuff. How do you feel about being a therapist? Sometimes I find myself doing that for clients. We had a client who had some bad experiences with previous developers, and some days he'd call me, and it seemed like the only purpose for the call was to complain about developers he had worked with before, and like talk about how they abandoned him, and left him with something that he couldn't support and stuff like that. I just listened patiently and explained to him why I'm not that person and how I'll never leave him. I wonder what ever happened to that guy. No, just kidding. We built a pretty cool thing for him, and he's doing fine, last I heard. Love attending networking events, schmoozing. Is schmoozing really your favorite thing in the whole wide world? Haha, business. Yeah, you might be surprised by how much time you spend doing things other than actually coding if you do it on a freelancing basis. Maybe you actually enjoy that stuff. Some people do. I enjoy part of it. Or maybe it's simply worth suffering through that other stuff in order to have that level of freedom. Okay. But when are you going to do that stuff? You need to spend enough of your time doing billable work that you can pay the bills, but you have to spend enough of your time doing that stuff that there's work to do, right? Time management. Thanks, Google Images. I don't know what this guy's doing. He looks a little like Christian Bale, but he's not. He's holding the clock. Time management. Yes. Okay. When you don't have traditional hours and you're ultimately working for yourself, it's also very easy to work all the time. So you have to have a lot of discipline to get up in the morning, go and actually be productive all day and not get distracted if you work from home especially. It takes a lot of discipline, but it also takes a certain type of discipline to shut the computer the heck down at night and remember to have a life so you don't work yourself to an early grave and ruin all your personal relationships. So if I scared you away, running straight to the nearest cubicle farm to collect your steady paycheck, there are definitely real advantages to so-called real jobs. Truly, stability is the biggest advantage of a traditional job, depending on the job. Obviously, there's no guarantee of complete stability, but if you work for like Salesforce, you can be pretty sure that the paychecks are going to arrive on time and the check's going to clear. They probably have the money in the bank. Oh, I totally should have had in all the other jobs that you have to do, in addition to bookkeeping and networking and management and sales and marketing, you also have to be a collection agency. I bet that's what you really wanted to do, right? Hunt down the people who owe you money? Yeah, me too. I'm so glad I got into this business. So, yeah, you don't have to do that either. And usually those jobs come with benefits beyond a steady paycheck. Paid time off, insurance, that stuff. Those things are huge, and sometimes it seems like for that reason alone, you have to have some sort of brain disorder to choose to strike out on your own. So if you are slightly out of your mind and you're not convinced that it's the worst idea in the history of ideas, where do you even start? And how do you know if you're ready to take the plunge? I can't answer that for you. I don't have any business telling you what's right for you, but I can tell you my story, and maybe there's something you can get out of that. So come with me on a magical journey to the far-off land of, 1992 or so, when I started mowing lawns for money, like so many other adolescents. I suppose that was in some sense my first freelancing experience. But I used that money to buy a computer because my family didn't have one. And a couple years after I got my computer, I got my first modem. That's what they sounded like. They were cool. Who's ever heard that sound before in their life? Yeah, all right. Modems. Telephone modems. Wow. So anyway, I got that about 1994. And then my computer could talk to other computers. I was mostly interested in using it to play Doom with my friends, one-on-one by dialing each other directly. But I also tried CompuServe and Prodigy and America Online. No one called it AOL yet. So I got my first email address and all that stuff. But at that time, those services didn't include access to the real internet. They were just these walled gardens. So I still didn't have real internet access yet. And after about 1 million free trials of AOL, it was awesome. You could just keep canceling and they'd keep giving you free trials. I finally got real internet access in 96. And I even paid for a second phone line in the house too, after one too many times of downloading an enormous file, like 20 megs or something. And my sister would pick up the phone, be like, no! Oh, it was horrible. So, yeah, I got my own second phone line. And yeah, 96, got a modem, learned a tiny bit of HTML, and like 2 months later, I was like, I'm starting a business. I can do web. Why not? Sounded better than working at Wendy's. So a couple of my dumb classmates and I started a company called Web Exposure because the name was available. We got a business license and somehow even got a client who was willing to pay us money to do a thing. As it turns out, of the three of us, I was the only one who was actually interested in learning how to make the stuff. So that didn't last a whole long time, and that ended up being the only client. But hey, we did it. And guess where I ended up? Wendy's. For about 6 months. Before too long, I convinced my parents to let me quit the fast food game and do solo web design. Like, the problem was those other guys. Now I was Star Image because the name was available. And I made a sweet logo with a nice swoosh in it. It was so original. There were so few other logos just like it in 1997. Yeah, everybody had the same logo in 1997. It doesn't matter if your company had been around forever like Sony. It was like, okay, we need to add some swooshes in here or people think we're behind the times. We got to catch up with Midas. So I got one very small client at that time, and that was enough to replace quite a few weeks of making $5.15 an hour in fast food, even though it wasn't much money. I wish I remembered how I got that client, but I don't. I remember being told no an awful lot, but I don't remember landing that first client. I certainly made it very low risk for them. It was a few $100, like $300 or $400, which was a ton to me and not much to them. And they had no web presence at all. So, at worst, they went from having no website to having a website that looked like it was made by a high schooler. But all the local businesses that had websites at all had websites that looked like they were made by a high schooler. Because they probably were. And when I did try to sell to local businesses at the time, the biggest challenge wasn't convincing them that I should be the one to make them a website. The challenge was convincing them that there was any benefit whatsoever to even having a website. It was a different time. And guess who was terrible at explaining why they should? Well, because, I don't know, your menu? So in 98, I graduated from high school. And there you are calculating how old I am. Yep, I'm ancient. I graduated and spent the summer working for the YMCA and endlessly redesigning my own personal site. And I started college and kept doing freelance web design instead of getting a campus job. In my computer science curriculum, which again, that wasn't that long ago, I don't even know if anyone ever said the word internet in 4 years. They basically didn't acknowledge that the web existed. So I just kept doing that stuff on the side, and that's how I learned this stuff, because pretty much every job I've ever had has been doing web stuff. So yeah, I learned the theory, but I was doing it on the side the whole time. And so are you now. Go you. So the freelancing at that point lasted through the spring and summer of my freshman year, the summer after. And by then I had some slightly bigger clients, like $1,000 or more, plus maybe a few bucks a month for hosting. I was just determined to avoid getting a real job at all costs. And I do remember how I got some of those clients. They were people with whom I had some personal connection, by and large. A dental practice that my brother-in-law worked for. I had a friend whose dad ran a bank, and they didn't have a website. My family knew some folks who owned a huge biosolids business, and they didn't have a website. You know what biosolids are? It's crap. Big tankers full of crap. Feces, literally, like for fertilizer, stuff like that. Biosolids. Now you know a new euphemism. But I ran out of stuff like that pretty quickly because I was still terrible at sales. When school started back up in the fall, I went ahead and got an internship with University Computing Services. Is anybody doing anything like that right now, like working in the IT department at your university? Quite a few people in the sort of, when you decide to show up. That basically, yeah. So that was pretty traditional IT work and a preview of what a real job might look like. I was to spend a semester working the help desk and then a semester sitting in the computer room and pulling tapes from the tape library when the mainframe called for them. So this was a big room with, the big, I want to say refrigerator size, but they were much bigger than refrigerators. And these dumb terminals, these green screen things. And every once in a while, something would flash on one of those with a tape number. I'd go into the tape library, pull this tape out, go stick it in the machine, so then somebody else, like a programmer upstairs, could do their job because I got the piece of data they needed. This was 1999, folks. This wasn't that long ago. They eventually replaced that with robots. I don't know if they're off the mainframe or not. But yeah, that was fun and enriching. Learned how to read numbers. So the summer after my sophomore year, I got an internship with the big employer in my hometown. Anybody from Kokomo? So I got an internship there, and it paid really well, insanely well for a summer job, and I had quite a few friends working there too. Big bureaucratic organization, though, and my first exposure to cubicle farms and all of that. But by then, I had learned several programming languages, including a couple that were common on the server side, so I could build sites with persistent data and stuff. It was cool. Office Space had just come out on video, and the interns spent the whole summer talking about it, as we were pretty much living it. If you're too young for Office Space, it's directed by the creator of Silicon Valley. Despite the overall nature of the organization, though, I was lucky to be working in a division that no one was really paying much attention to, so I got to work on some cool stuff. If you can make it through life without ever having a traditional job, I'm happy for you. But if you're determined to work for yourself but can't pull it off just yet, I think your time with traditional employment will be well spent. You'll learn a ton about working with others and getting things done even when you have zero power. Being in those powerless situations when you're expected to somehow make things happen when they don't give you permission to do anything, that's good experience. Figuring out how to do things when you're not allowed to do anything. It's pretty fun. And you'll develop empathy for people who do work in those situations. Because it's easy sometimes for people to be condescending if they're independent or like, yeah, he has a real job. He's a wage slave or whatever. But if you do it for a little while, you understand. People are just working to, pay for their lives. Work isn't life. Unless you're fretless. Wow. No, that would be a bad thing. No, I'm just kidding about that. Work isn't life. Life is work. No, just kidding. So fall of 2000, after my internship, I started the kind of relevant portion of my university internship. I had an experience that I've since learned is pretty common in internships, and what this boot camp is sort of designed to avoid. The full-timer who was supposed to supervise me in my university internship was pretty annoyed to have an intern. He didn't want one at all. I just created more work for him the way he saw it. What was he going to do? This person who worked on the student record system, what was he going to do with this student? What work could he create for that person where they wouldn't, A, hurt anything, and B, that he couldn't just do faster himself? And once when I had that enterprise software management job, I was forced to have an intern. I felt so bad for her because she was really nice and competent and stuff, but there was absolutely no work I could possibly assign to her. So this guy wasn't real sympathetic with me. He just wished I would hurry up and die already or something. So that wasn't a great experience. So I quit. And newly emboldened by having had some semi-real job experience and knowing some programming languages, I doubled down on freelancing. I'd run out of ideas for finding clients on my own, so I teamed up with my cousin in Illinois who could charm the skin off a snake, and we started an S-Corp, like a real company. We had ink in our name and everything. We had a lawyer. Speaking of which, our lawyer didn't have a website, so we made one for him. 17 years later, guess he's still using the website I made for him in 2000. I discovered that during session 1. Somebody found my old company and found the lawyer's website. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the one I made in the year 2000. This is amazing. That's not nearly as embarrassing as I expected it to be. Maybe after the slideshow's over. So my cousin found me quite a few gigs, and at this point, I really, really wanted to drop out of college and do this all the time. My parents actually bribed me to stay in. They said they'd pay my room and board if I finished college, and reluctantly I did. It was probably a good thing because my cousin was also a full-time real estate agent and had decided to become a full-time law student as well. He has a tendency to overcommit. So yeah, when he started law school, not because he wanted to be a lawyer, just because he thought maybe having a law degree would help his real estate business. He never took the bar. He went to law school and just kept doing the job he already had. He's a weirdo. He's a little like. But anyway, he sort of abandoned me. So I'm really glad I didn't drop out of school because I was still just horrible at sales. But I kept the corporation alive and did a little bit of freelancing on the side for a few years after that. But it would be a while before it would be my full-time job again. So I graduated in 2002 and got a job for a tiny, tiny company. And in my first month there, I kid you not, they had more than 100% turnover. More people quit or were fired in the first month I worked there than worked there. They fired almost everybody, hired a couple new people, and fired both of them. It was amazing. I started a 3-person company, and 4 people left the first month I was there. After about 6 months, I decided maybe that wasn't for me. So I quit and started teaching at a for-profit college, one of those that really ought to be illegal. And it was super unfulfilling. It was kind of fun, but they weren't motivated like all of you. They didn't. I don't know how they got out of high school. I don't know how they got out of bed in the morning because they barely did. We were supposed to actually call their parents if they didn't show up, which is actually against the law now, but I don't think FERPA was in place yet. But yeah, because then the school got less money. So if they didn't show up, these people who were 20 years old, we were supposed to call their parents because they missed a day. Anyway, I didn't stay there for long. 10 weeks, I think. Then I got a couple job offers, and I took one of them. That turned out to be a bad fit. And they reached that conclusion before I had a chance to quit. So, yeah, that happened. But I got another job. For those of you keeping track, that is 4 jobs my first year out of college. So I didn't just graduate knowing exactly what I was going to do for the rest of my career. But hey, that 4th one, my first year, I stayed there for a while. 7 years. For those of you saying 9 minus 3 is 6, Dave. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 7 years. Anyway. I did a tiny bit of freelancing on the side throughout that job. But I had a real job that I mostly liked eventually. I think I have time to tell this story in a little more detail than I did last time. So, yes, I got canned at that place that I'd worked at for about 2 months and found this job posting that said they were looking for someone who knew PHP and MySQL. I was like, hey, that's me. So I applied, and they called me for an interview, and I went in, and they asked me one technical question, which is, do you know what DNS is? I was like, yeah. They're like, what is it? I was like, it like translates domain names to IP addresses. They're like, okay, cool. And then the person just talked at me for like a half hour. And then they're like, okay, the big boss wants to talk to you. So I go in this room. There's this giant man named Bob. Dave knows who I'm talking about. This dude's hands, oh my gosh. They were enormous, a little intimidating. And he needed 2 chairs all times. He'd sit in a chair, and then he'd rest his enormous arm on the chair next to him at all times. It was just so huge. He didn't ask me a single question. He just talked. I was like, okay, is this a good sign? I guess. And then they were like, okay, we'll let you know maybe sometime next week. So I left and headed home. About 5 minutes later, before I got home, they called me and said, okay, you want the job? Like, yeah? Like, okay, cool, come in Monday. Sweet. So I actually started that job before I stopped getting paid for the old one, which is a pretty sweet deal if you can come up with it. I should get fired more often. No, not really. You should not get fired. It's bad. It's a really scary moment. So I started. I got in there, and they told me what my job actually was. Oh, and by the way, I bought a DNS book over the weekend. I was like, well, I don't know that much about DNS. I better read this. My job had nothing to do with DNS. So here's what it was. They showed me my cubicle, and I had 2 network cables coming in. One of them went through the company firewall. The other one was like raw internet. This place was actually a backbone provider. And then I had actually I think I had a little sonic firewall sitting on my desk. But these two lines were from completely different Class C IP addresses. So, IP addresses have 4 parts, right? The second part is the Class C. And that's like, that would be like 2 totally different ISPs. So definitely not the same person. So here's what I was supposed to do. And here's why they wanted someone who knew PHP. I was supposed to go on to forums and stuff and like establish a reputation, like talk to other programmers and be like, yeah, PHP, right? $, associative arrays, cool. I like those. And do that for a few weeks or months. And then I'd sign in from my other IP address and be like, hey guys, you know where a PHP dev can find a cool web hosting company? And my other guy would be like, yeah, dude, you should check out Puma Hosting. I'm totally not a shill. I'm a member of this community, by golly. That's what I was supposed to do, astroturfing, fake grassroots. This company had been around for a long time, and they like, most of their actual customers paid like $30,000 a month to rent huge cabinets in a data center. And somebody there thought, what we really need to do is get into the $9 a month web hosting game. Oh, we'll create a new company name so no one knows it's us selling this cheap crap. But that's what we need to do. Well, I think he actually wanted to do that so that, like, if you were talking to someone at a big local business who was about to sign for something big, he could be like, oh, I hear you manage your church's website. Well, here, I'll give you a coupon code for free web hosting. So we had like 30 or 40 sites on that thing. All but 2 of them were free with coupon codes, because that's all it was there for. Well, sooner or later, they decided this was maybe a poor use of resources and canceled that project. And then they still had me. And about that time, they acquired another company, a consulting company, and kind of realigned their business and started doing managed services, which is like outsourced IT. So yeah, they had this big data center with all these huge cabinets full of servers and switches and routers and so on. But what they started selling was management of the networking equipment as a service. So they'd pay this company, and they would manage all their router configs and switch configs and all this other stuff that I don't know much about. So that guy became my boss. And of course, Giant Bob was still there. This new guy came, like, he said, okay, I'm your boss now. You want to give me your resume? Like, okay, here's what I can do. He's like, cool. Like when people's printer breaks, why don't you go help them when they can't print? Like, okay, I'm becoming that person. I became the help desk, the LAN support guy, which was all, I forgot my password or I can't print. So, hey, I still had a job. I was happy. So I made myself a little tiny ticket system using my PHP and MySQL skills. It was a little crappy ticket system, no more complicated than the stuff we built in this class, less complicated than NoteHerder. So I made that for myself just to keep track of all those requests. And one day my boss truly just like came by my cubicle and saw that. He was like, you wrote that? And I was like, yeah. He was like, well, we have a 24-hour, 365-day-a-year call center, and they keep track of all their trouble tickets in text files. I was like, oh my gosh. He was like, can you do this for them? I was like, of course. And pretty soon that was my whole job. They were like, okay, well, can you make it keep track of which customers' servers are in which cabinets? I was like, yeah, sure, why not? So I just kept adding feature after feature after feature to this thing. Oh, we need to be able to comment on these things. Oh, yeah, we'll comment on this. Oh, we need to add attachments to the comments. Oh, okay, sure, we can do that. And I just kept adding feature after feature after feature. Well, I was the only programmer in the whole place, because this was like network engineers and stuff. They had no programmers, just me. And so for like 4 years, I was the only programmer there, which meant I wasn't hanging out with anybody who was any better at it than me. So any growth was entirely up to me to be self-motivated to improve. And I had no one with good habits to learn from. So yeah, I was cranking out features, but my code was an unreadable mess. And you may remember the scale of awesomeness from the first day. Does it work? Does it work well? I got to the point on my own that I can make things that worked pretty well. Decent user experience, robust. It was really, really hard to get an error of any kind. But every time they asked for a new feature at that point, it was like, oh my gosh, it is so impossible to add new features to this thing because the code is so disorganized. Because I'm this guy who had no idea what he was doing, and I just keep adding more and more code to this thing. I have files that are 500 lines long. Unmaintainable mess. So about 4 years in, I convinced them it was time to do a full rewrite of the whole thing. And most of the time you think you should do a full rewrite, you probably shouldn't. But in this case, it was probably the right move. And I said, I need help. I need another developer. They just want too many features. So I hired this guy named Miles, who had a haircut that looked like Wolverine, had earrings, kind of walked like this, and I was like this freaking guy. And then he started, and like a half hour into his first guy, I was like, this freaking guy. All right, I found my people. So he was a lot like me in many respects, born the same day, 3 years later, as it turns out. And he had become a little cynical too, but we were both kind of excited about new stuff and about coding when we actually got to sort of make decisions on our own, which we mostly got to there. So Ruby on Rails was brand new at that time, and we were both excited to learn it. So we told, by then that other guy had left and Giant Bob was my boss. We were like, so we should totally rewrite this whole thing in Ruby on Rails, which no one's using in production yet. Pause. Like, okay. Like, sweet. So we started rewriting the whole thing in Ruby on Rails. And then, it was so exciting using this new thing, and it was open source. And it was like, oh my gosh, have you heard about test-driven development? We should totally do test-driven development. Let's do test-driven development. Oh my gosh, have you heard of this framework for the test? Oh man, we should do this framework for the test. Have you heard about behavior-driven test? Oh man. And just stuff like this. And it was like, oh my gosh, Miles said, there's a local meetup for Ruby developers. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid of other people. I don't like going to this stuff. He was like, go with me and it won't be as scary. And I was like, okay, cool. So I went to that thing with this guy, Miles. And Dave Jones was there. And I never saw him again. No. I don't know how much later, not very much later, whoever was organizing that meetup decided they didn't want to do it anymore, and Miles took it over. And he does it to this day. And some of you met him the other day because we had a meetup last week. Yes, that Miles. The very same. He doesn't have the Wolverine haircut anymore. So anyway, we were hanging out with other developers who were also excited about making their code better. Not about just making things that work, but about making readable code and got excited about that kind of thing. And we could feed off of each other and reinforce each other's good habits instead of the bad ones. It's really easy sometimes to take the lazy route and just make something work as fast as you can. But if you hang out with other good developers, they can remind you, well, remember what a pain in the neck this is going to be to maintain in a month if we don't do this right. And so you slow down and you do it right. So hey, hanging out with other developers who are as good as or better than you is a really good way to get better yourself. So once I was hanging out with another developer all day when we weren't distracted and talking about starting a band and stuff. I don't even know where I was going with that. Yes. We did right away. So we both worked there for, I don't remember how long it was, 3 years or so. And then some things happened, and I got married, and she lived in Bloomington. So I moved to Bloomington, and I got a different job as an enterprise software manager. Yeah. And I was absolutely miserable. But before I left, we're like, okay, so we need to hire somebody else. Hey, Dave Jones, you want to come work? Yeah, he said. Let's do that. And then I quit. And then 3 months after that, Miles quit too, and we left poor Dave there by himself. And we never saw him again. No. So 3 years went by, and Miles quit, took another job, and then he started doing some complete freelancing. And I had this management job that I absolutely hated. and became a miserable, bitter human being. And one day, Miles was at a local developer conference. I only learned this like a month ago, by the way. I hadn't heard our origin story from his perspective. He was at a conference, and the speaker was saying, like, figure out how you work best. Do you work best on your own or as part of a team? And Miles was thinking to himself, I work better alone. No, I don't. I work better as part of a team. I should text Dave. This one, not that guy. So he texted me. It was like, hey, I was thinking, we should probably start a, yes, please, for the love of God, let's start a thing. Get me out of here, please, before I die. So we started Fretless. And that's what I still do today. So we had one client lined up before I quit that job that I hated. And so we knew we weren't going to starve for at least 6 weeks or so. And then in the first 3 months, because remember, Miles, the super extrovert who was willing to go to meetups and stuff, before I got okay with that kind of thing, everybody wanted to work with him because he's a cool dude. He looked like Wolverine. No, he didn't look like Wolverine at that point. So about 3 months in, we actually got a really big client. And we were like, we need to hire another person. Hey, Dave Jones, want to come work? Yay. So we just go around stealing him from other people. That's kind of what we do. So in case you were wondering, what does Fretless do? We steal Dave Jones. That's what we do. So we make web and mobile apps, basically, on a consulting basis. Sometimes there are startups who have an idea for a product and no technical chops, and they just need someone to build that thing for them, so we do. Sometimes there's an existing product and the old developers left and they need someone to take it over, so they call us. Or sometimes, and this happens the most often, a company already has a development team, but they need more help than they can get. Or they just need more help temporarily, either because they've got a deadline coming up or because they've got a new project that they're spinning off and they want to get it off to a good start, or because they have just a bunch of inexperienced developers and they need some senior developers sitting around teaching them some good habits. Maybe they have some senior developers, but they're all too busy churning out new features and don't have time to deal with the questions from the noobs, so they bring us in to do that thing because we like doing that thing. So that's kind of what we do. We build apps under those circumstances, and every once in a while we teach boot camps and stuff like that. So yeah, that's us. Along the way, there was a lot of personal growth involved. You notice, like, I got a lot more excited when Miles started working there. I got a lot more excited talking about it when Miles started working there too. Because being around other people with good attitudes, by the way, that's important. If you're hanging around really negative people, you're going to develop a terrible attitude too. And actually, before he started there, I was hanging around with about the most negative person I've ever met in my life, and I didn't realize what it was doing to me until I started hanging out with a positive person. I was like, oh yeah, that kind of made me like him. But also, so my first year out of college, I was living in Fort Wayne for that first job, and I was hanging out with some friends up there, and they were all talking about another person in that circle of friends who wasn't there that day and how much they hated him. Everybody hated this guy. I hated him too. And they were just talking about all these personality traits he had that just made him unbearable to be around. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's me. I'm like that too. And I started to recognize these own traits in myself. Not as exaggerated as his, I sure as heck hope. I hope this whole thing wasn't just so I would overhear and take a hint. But it's easier if you can recognize those things in someone else and start catching yourself when you start to do those things. None of you are perfect. Not even you, Tom. Nobody's perfect. And self-reflection is important. Figure out what you're not great at and work on it. We'll talk a little more about that, especially when Seth tells his life story next. But I, at least that early, figured out a few things. I figured out I was way more condescending than I realized and interrupted people way too much and all this stuff because there was this other guy who did that stuff and everyone hated him. And I didn't have a whole lot of friends. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is why I don't have any friends. Because I interrupt everybody and act condescending. But I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to help. Someone doesn't know how to do a thing, and I try to show them how to do a thing. And, you know, they try to ask clarifying questions, but they just don't get it. I just need to talk louder, and then they'll understand it. That's how you teach somebody, right? So thankfully, I figured some of this out when I was 23 and not 37. But you know, it's an ongoing process. Because Seth's going to talk next, and I'm going to interrupt him in the most condescending way possible. So anyway, we'll talk more about that momentarily. Any questions about that? Any questions about how we got here, sort of, so far? Usually what happens is one person asks a question, and then we find out there were a million questions. But yeah, Tom.
I see that you are also
Bald? Yeah. Oh, okay.
I see that, you know, from the LinkedIn that you also learn pretty well mastering in the SQL, like the database.
So here's a funny story about my LinkedIn. Somebody endorsed me for SQL. And now, like, everybody endorses me for SQL. I'm like, guys, that's not what I really do. Quit endorsing me for that. Endorse me for the stuff that's actually my job. At that job that I did for 7 years in the 2000s, at some point they decided we need to become like a Microsoft certified partner. So we need this many employees to get some sort of Microsoft certification. I was like, okay, if I have to, I guess I'll get a SQL Server certification. So I got a SQL Server certification. So then everyone would look at my LinkedIn and was like, oh, SQL, that must be his thing. Like, oh my gosh, guys, I was forced to get that. I know a reason, and when I had the enterprise software management job where we weren't actually building software, but we did have a database that we had to deal with, on the very rare occasion that I did anything truly technical, it was also SQL related. So again, it was like, that's what people knew about me at that job too. They were like, oh, this guy's really good at SQL. He never wants to do that again as long as he lives. But yeah, I mean, I guess I can do that. So anyway, what was your question?
I just saw that you're pretty good at it, and saying that. So is it the way that you choose to be majorly focused on front end, or do you think a programmer should be front end, back end, have a suite?
Yeah, I mean, there's no one size fits all. The question was, you know, should you focus on the front end or back end? We are absolutely full stack developers. I like doing both. Sometimes it gets really tiresome fighting with browsers when you have stuff that isn't just for a boot camp and it actually has to work for customers and you have to actually troubleshoot those little tiny issues in Internet Explorer or whatever. Sometimes that's really frustrating and you just want to write the back end where you know that you can count on the server to do what you ask it to do, more or less. But there are a lot of front-end jobs right now. It's kind of, there's kind of a renewed interest because of React and Angular and stuff like that. I mean, I do full stack, so it's kind of hard to say that I don't think you should do that thing. But again, get really good at something before you get crazy with the other. But I think being full stack is pretty appealing. Knowing how, so you can build the whole thing from scratch, even without using something like Firebase. It's pretty nice. I don't know. Do you have a different answer to that?
I agree. I mean, I think knowing, even if you focus on one more than the other, knowing at least enough to know how the other one works pretty well, and you could write something even if it's simpler on the other end, helps a lot to know. Like, say you focus on front end, but you can write a decent back end. You could probably write a better front end now you know what goes on in the back end. You know exactly what to make a good interface there.
How does it decide to send you that JSON back when you make that fetch? Well, you can write the thing that decides to send that JSON. Yeah. I don't know. I think full stack's cool. John, did you have a question?
Yes. Do you think it's possible for freelancers to oversaturate the web development landscape?
Oh, it's certainly possible, and there have probably been times when that was the case. I don't think it's necessarily the case right now. But again, you have to do things to differentiate yourself, because actually there probably are a ton, and some who can't find work. So you gotta stand out from the crowd somehow. Some of that's just being better at self-promotion, and I'm terrible at it. But thankfully, I'm not the only person at Fretless. But like, that's another nice thing about being full stack. Someone needs JavaScript help, they can bring us in. Someone needs backend help, they can bring us in. And I think another thing we said on the first day was that one of the best things you can learn is how to learn, right? And how to learn new languages and new frameworks. You should learn one pretty well before you start going crazy learning more. But if you keep learning, subscribe to these newsletters and keep trying things out and get in the habit of just learning new things, then that's a skill in and of itself. Because like when we took the job that we were doing for seven months doing Angular 2, we had never used Angular 2. And we told them that. We told them that in the sales meetings. Like, look, or Ionic or Cordova, we were using tons of technologies we'd never used before, but we had a track record of taking jobs where we didn't know the technology yet, and we were successful at it. So, getting good at learning things is a good way to set yourself apart. Once you have a track record and can point to previous clients and stuff and say, hey, we built this thing and we didn't know this language before we started. That helps a lot when we're trying to land jobs. We didn't know React yet when we said we would teach this boot camp. That was a while ago, but we didn't know it yet. But we knew we could learn it.
So now that you have a bunch of experience and you use these tools really well, do you ever consider trying to develop better tools?
Like actually develop frameworks and stuff? It certainly crosses my mind. One story that I usually tell as part of this, that's because it's in the next slideshow, right? I'll tell you a story kind of about that. But yeah, sometimes that's tempting. Like when we make the website for the class, we use kind of a static site generator with a lot of customizations. Because I don't know if you noticed, but the terminal commands in there are inside a little box that looks just like the Mac terminal. If you're in the Mac setup section, if you're in the Windows setup section, it looks just like Git Bash, complete with the little icon and stuff. That's all CSS, except for the icon. So we did that. And it would be a pain in the neck if we had to put all of that every single time that we need to put a little terminal snippet. So we wrote a little thing that makes it so, okay, you just wrap the word term in a couple curly braces and angle brackets, and then you write what you want in there, and then you close that, and voila, it spits out this thing. Oh, you want it to be the Windows version? You just say OS equals Windows, etc. So, we kind of wrote our own tools to make that website to a point. Other questions so far? Yeah.
If you want to learn back end, what language would you recommend?
Our favorite is Ruby. It's no longer the hot new thing, and there are lots of options. There's always Node, so Node is JavaScript. It's its own weird thing in some respects because it doesn't run in the browser, so it's a different engine running the thing. You don't have window dot anything. The global object is a totally different object, but you can at least reuse a lot of what you've learned. You have promises and all that stuff. So Node, Express, those are related. So Node is kind of the platform. Express is a web server. So if you want to learn back-end stuff in JavaScript, that's the stuff you kind of want to look up, Node and Express. Learn how to use those with React. But yeah, I still think Ruby and Ruby on Rails are... Ruby is just a very nice language. It kind of makes sense the way it's designed and what certain commands do in a way that sometimes isn't true of JavaScript. It's just so lovely. It's hard to explain. But it's an object-oriented language that really sticks with the object-oriented stuff really consistently.
Really fun. It's just a really fun language to work in, to be honest.
This is true. And the community is great, especially the local community in Indianapolis. So yeah, and it's pretty easy to learn, so I'm all about that too. Making a JSON API in Ruby on Rails is so easy, to do the basics. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I'm interested mostly in user experience and user interface, particularly research, but I've had developers at IU tell me that that's not important or necessary. So how important would you guys, as professionals, say it is?
Speaking of condescending, right? I think it's super important. Like, I can't speak specifically to the research area or whatever, but yeah, user experience is very important. Let's pretend for a moment that Uber doesn't have the most toxic company culture in the history of business. Like, part of why they took off so much is the user experience of hailing a ride suddenly got way, way easier. The whole thing was about user experience. The iPhone, it could do less than a BlackBerry on launch in some respects, but the user experience was so much better. And, the web portion of it worked way, way, way better. It's the first time you could really get the real internet on a phone. User experience is super important. Yeah.
It's equally as important for people who are interested in something else to be well versed in front end and back end.
What do you mean by interested in something else?
So research or marketing or sales, but with a technology background.
I might have to talk about this later because I might have to know more specifics because I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I'm sorry. But yeah, user experience, super important. Not every single individual person needs to have that as their focus, especially if they're on the back end. But even on the back end, if you're writing an API, the developer experience of using that API matters. Like, designing the endpoints of the API is really important. And that's like one of the most frustrating parts of our job sometimes is that the people who wrote the APIs we're working with, like, had no consideration for how someone was actually going to use the thing. And it's excruciating, and it doesn't give error messages when something goes wrong. It just doesn't work. So like, when I write an API, I try to make sure that we give good error messages that actually give someone a clue what's wrong. Like, you don't know if you screwed up one of the inputs. You don't know you don't know what you did. Anyway, yeah, John.
The next developer at Fretless, the next guy you will hire, is he going to be a rock star developer, or is he just going to be average and really excel?
We're never going to hire again. I'm just kidding. Well, actually, that's kind of what the entire rest of the class is going to be about, sort of. We are 5 people total, and that's including one person who does nothing but sales. See aforementioned note about me being terrible at sales. But we only hired him a year and a half ago or so. Yeah, so actually, that's a good segue into the next thing. Anybody else? Questions at this point?